Okay, so we continue, and well, it's not Mike Proctor standing here. I hope you're not too disappointed, but David promised to do his best. Okay, so he's giving the speech, and it's about long-wave instability. Go ahead, David. Yes. Ah, yeah. Yeah. Kumiko and Paul, maybe you can both move.
Okay. Right, I know many of you were looking forward for a rare glimpse of Mike Proctor in action. I was. But you're going to have to put up with me. I'm sorry. I'll try. I could talk very loudly. That would be my best Mike Proctor impression. I don't know if Mike is one of these 9 participants. So be careful. Right, so what's it all about? So this talk is slightly different, I suppose, to many of the talks we've heard. We've heard lots of interesting talks really addressing either the geomagnetic problem or the solar dynamo problem. This one is not really addressing either of those, but it is addressing some issues with mean field theory. So mean field theory, even though we haven't had talks on mean field theory per se, mean field theory, of course, pervades everything that, that people talk about. Alpha effects, alpha omega dynamos, Parker loops, all of these things are mean field concepts. And so, but there are still problems with mean field theory, I believe. So this is an attempt to see how we might address those problems with some success and some not so success. So this is work that Mike and I have been doing for a while, too long really, in collaboration with Johannes Mason, who's at Exeter, and Alistair Rutledge, who's at Leeds, and it builds on work that Mike and I did with Alice Courvoisier several years ago. Whoops, boink, boink. Okay, so what's the problem, if there is a problem? So mean field theory, classical mean field theory, is essentially a kinematic theory. It addresses the induction equation. And it's based, there is a huge, not really assumption in a way, in the theory, in that the fluctuating field, so you split the field into a mean and a fluctuating part, and you write down the mean equation, you write down the fluctuating field equation. And the fluctuating field equation has, dt, b, and all of this. And then on the right-hand side, it has b naught dot grad u, where b naught is the mean. Okay? So how everything progresses is that one then argues that little b, the fluctuating field, is linearly proportional to b naught, the mean field. In a kinematic theory, then the mean EMF is also proportional to b naught, and we expand, and that's where we get the alpha effect. Okay. But it also assumes in that if there were no mean field, there would be no fluctuating field. Okay, you've got linear operator on fluctuating field is b naught dot grad u, and it assumes that it's driven by the b naught dot grad u term. Whereas, of course, that doesn't have to be the case. You can have growth of fluctuations all by themselves. Okay, what we would now call a small-scale dynamo, the kind of things that have been studied in fast dynamos, for example. So, for example, suppose you had a helical flow, and you had high magnetic Reynolds number, what would happen if you put a magnetic field into it? Okay, you might have done your theory and said, I've got lots of helicity, I'm going to get a large-scale field out of this. But what would probably happen is if the small scale flow is turbulent, then that will generate a dynamo all by itself on a fast time scale, okay? And that whether there is a large scale field in your theory or not, that won't matter, because the thing that will have happened was that the small scale field will have grown, okay? So that's what this says. But given that, you might say, well, maybe that's the wrong starting point. Maybe a better starting point, given that we do observe large-scale fields and all of this, maybe we should be starting from an MHD state rather than a hydro state. Okay, so the base state that we might consider is one that you might get from the saturation of a small-scale dynamo. Okay, could you then have large-scale perturbations on top of that MHD state? So that was what we were looking, rather than the hydro state. Okay, so that's what we were looking at. And how it's going to go is it's going to go a bit like mean field theory. There's going to be a theory. It looks very nice. And then there'll be problems. Okay, and that seems to be how it is with mean field theory, I think. So let's deal with the good bit. The good bit is the theory, because the theory has some interesting features, I think. So this is these are the equations. We've seen these a few times, just incompressible MHD, okay? So the starting point is a complicated MHD state, okay? And how I like to think about it is as the saturated state of a small-scale dynamo, okay? And these U and B, like this, are that's our basic state, okay? So these could be, they're 3D, they're turbulent, but they're small scale, okay? I haven't defined what a scale is. They're small scale in the sense that I'm going to look for something on a long scale compared to them, okay? Now we perturb them, okay? So we just perturb. This is going to be a linear theory. So we're going to perturb them with little u and little b, okay, in the obvious way. And then we're going to split them into mean and fluctuating components in the obvious way, okay? So this is our equation now for the mean flow and the mean field. Of course, it's got all these bits, the sort of bits that we used to, but even more of them. You know, this is the Reynolds stress, if you like, linearized Reynolds stress, linearized Maxwell stress. All of these bits are, of course, the EMF, the mean EMF, but they have bits from the basic state B with a perturbation U, and they have bits from a mean state U with a perturbation B, okay? Oh, and then you could subtract one from the other or just write down the fluctuating equations. At this stage, it's getting messy. It's just like normal mean field theory, but more messy, okay? And then, of course, if we could solve these, right? If by some miracle we could solve these for the fluctuating fields, then we're done, right? We bung them back in here and we're done. We've solved for the mean. But that is it's kind of impossible. And that is just like in classical mean field theory. Typically, you can't solve for the fluctuations, except in certain circumstances like low magnetic Reynolds number or short sudden approximation, okay? But that is not a fatal objection, because the point is that the fluctuations, of course, well, this is a linear theory. The fluctuations are linear in B and U, the basic state B and U, and their derivatives, okay? So formally, you can write down mean field equations, okay? And these are they. So you have an equation for the mean velocity and an equation for the mean magnetic field. Okay. So there's something interesting straight away. We have a fixation in our community, as you might say, with the alpha effect. Okay, we love the alpha effect. And the alpha effect is wheeled out all the time. And there is an alpha effect. There's two alpha effects, if you like. But there are lots of other effects, right? So this is what Frisch would call the AKA effect. This is essentially the growth of mean flows through the Reynolds stress. But there is also the generation of mean flows through the mean field. And there are two alpha effects. Okay, so this is the one we know and love. But there's this one as well. So once you're in an MHD state, you have no real reason for favoring one alpha rather than anything else. Okay, if you're really looking at the instabilities of an MHD state, all of these things matter. You have no reason to prejudice field over flow, no reason to prejudice alpha over this alpha over either these alphas or gammas. Okay. So these are either pseudo-tensors, like here, okay, or they're tensors. As I say, you can make and you can play the same, you can make progress in the same limits that you can make progress for classical mean field electrodynamics. So one of them is small magnetic Reynolds number. You might argue if you had small magnetic Reynolds number, you're not even going to get a small scale dynamo, which is what I said you needed as your base state. That is true. You can force the induction equation through some external current in order to allow yourself to be at low RM. Or you can do short sudden turbulence. Okay, we heard some of that. I think Bruce mentioned short sudden approximation. So it's worth looking at the short sudden approximation because it gives nice results. Okay. So under the short sudden, which means that things kind of in terms of the Parker loops, essentially they rise and twist and just on a short time scale, okay. Then one of the gammas vanishes, okay, but we get these expressions for the alphas and one of the gammas, okay, and they're complicated, okay, but there are two things, at least two things that are, I think, worth pointing out. So earlier in this, in the program, back in September, October, we had quite a few discussions on alpha and how many bits it had, okay. So there is this long-running debate about the alpha effect, the kinetic alpha effect, the magnetic alpha effect. Then there's the debate about if you've got a magnetic alpha effect, where the heck does it come from? So I would say this is where it comes from. So this is essentially helicity, right? This is u dot curl u, okay? And this is b dot j. So this is the kinetic alpha, and this is the magnetic alpha. But it only comes about because we've got an MHD basic state, okay? Does not come about as a sort of saturation term for a kinematic dynamo theory, which is how it's often portrayed, but this is really how it comes about, okay? And then we have these other two. Now, these are interesting as well, in a way. We haven't really explored everything that could arise from these, but you can see that this term, so this other alpha bit, right, is essentially, with the epsilon here, is essentially a u dot j term. So that's kind of unusual in a way, isn't it? We don't normally, we're used to u dot omega, we're used to u dot b as cross helicity, we're used to b dot j as current helicity, but this is a u dot j term, okay? And these are something similar also, okay? I'm not really going to go into those too much detail. But you might. I mean, what is interesting is that you can get we think, you can get a growth of a large-scale field without any alpha effect from these other terms. Okay, so we can put the alpha effect to 0, and but we've still got regeneration terms from these gammas and things, and you can do the eigenvalue problem, and it seems that there's no reason why you can't get growth of this basic state without any alpha effects. Okay. So there's even more possibilities for things that could give you large scale or mean fields, if you like. So as it says, coupling between the mean momentum induction equations, but you do need anisotropy to get these gammas. Okay. So that's the good bit. Okay. That's the theory. And so the theory, I think, is quite nice. We have growth, possible growth due to these new tensors and everything. So if you wanted to implement such a theory, what would you do? So you do what one does in the classical mean field case. You have an MHD state, and you come along with a mean field, a uniform field, okay, and a uniform flow, and plonk them in, and you work out all these tensors. Okay, you work out the EMF to give you your alphas, you work out the Reynolds stresses, etc., to give you your gammas. Having done all those by imposing uniform fields, then you know what the tensors are, and that tells you immediately something about the growth of large-scale fields without having to do the dynamo problem itself, right? That's the beauty of mean field. If we go back to the classical mean field problem, that is the beauty of mean field electrodynamics. You don't have to solve the dynamo problem in some sense. You work out alpha, in that case, which is all to do with flow properties, and amazingly, once you know that, then you can say something about the dynamo, okay? But, so that's what you'd like to do, and the question is, does it work? And the answer is yes and no, okay. So when does it work? So what we'd like to do is to look at following on, say, from the works of Glyn Roberts, who had these, very important papers in the early 70s, where he took these flows that we now call Roberts cells, which were 2D, depended on X and Y, and that's a great help, because then the field becomes monochromatic in Z, and life is easier. Of course, you might say, but you're studying your base state is a saturated dynamo. That can't just depend on X and Y. That would be true. But you can make yourself an MHD state. You can make yourself a 2D MHD state by taking a forcing, which, say, would drive a Roberts flow, and putting a uniform field in. That gives you a 2D MHD base state. That's great, because then you can do all the analysis, you can work out all these alphas, and even better, you can actually do the dynamo problem. And you can check whether everything works. So that's what we did a while back, and we took standard forcings that people take. So they're a bit more complicated than the Roberts cell, but they are Roberts cell sorts of things. So this one was taken by Frisch, what he called the AKA forcing. This one was one of the early fast dynamo flows by Atani. So this is a pulsating Roberts flow, if you like, and this is a sort of wave-like Roberts flow. Okay, Roberts flow is steady. So you have this flow, it's 2D, everything's 2D, you come along and you put in a mean field and you work out the EMF. And there's the EMF, and it's beautiful. You get an absolutely nice answer. You do all the other tensors, everything works a treat. You've got all those elements of all those tensors without having done the dynamo problem, as it were. And then you know about the growth. What's a large-scale mode in this context? A large-scale mode is an e to the ikz where k is small. Okay. So these are the comparisons. Of course, this theory is only, we have no turbulent diffusion, so the growth rate looks like is linear in the wave number. So these are the predictions of the theory, the straight lines where growth rate is proportional to the wave number. Of course, in reality, eventually the k squared term will come in, so we only expect these to agree at small k, and they agree very well at small k. So far, so good. Okay. What could go wrong? Okay, so two things can go wrong. At least two things can go wrong. So this is one thing that can go wrong. And this can go wrong in the classical kinematic theory, if you like. So these are measurements of the EMF in rotating convection. Okay. So you take plane layer rotating convection. It has lots of helicity. Okay. So just hydrodynamic for the minute. Okay. It's full of helicity. It has a well-defined, even though it's turbulent, it has a very well-defined helicity distribution. So naively, you might think, well, that's good. Of course it's good. Helicity equals alpha equals dynamo. Okay. Then you work out what the EMF is. And the EMF, so this is not a dynamo. This one is. These two are taken to be below the dynamo threshold, deliberately. So there's no dynamo here. It's just rotating convection. You put in a field, and you work out the EMF. And you can see it's horrible. Okay. So Bruce showed a picture on day one, was it, of the Parker loops. And of course, the Parker loop picture only works if all the loops agree with each other. Okay, I mean, this is in Keith's book as well. You know, once the loops twist, if one guy's twisting 26 times and its neighbor is twisting 27, then on average, you don't get much. And really, you don't get much because each individual component is good. But the sum of them, which of course is what you need, is really poor, and it reduces to a diffusive limit. So alpha, which is a velocity, goes from being an advective velocity to being a diffusive velocity. Okay, so that is a problem. And these are the time averages. Okay, cumulative averages. Sorry. So you have to go on forever to work out an EMF, which is then really small. So you have to think whether that is what we need. And then there are other problems. Whoops. I don't know what speed Mike was planning on going, but it was faster than I am going. Yeah, okay, it was twice as fast as I'm going. All right. It's okay. Yeah. But this is another important problem, that you have an MHD state, saturated, it's chaotic, you put in a field, you try and measure an average, and the average grows exponentially. It didn't in those that I just showed you, in those 2D ones. But for a chaotic flow, that's what will happen in general. Well, then you're completely in a mess, because you can't work out an average if it's growing exponentially. It doesn't make much sense. Okay, so this is the sort of thing. You might take an ABC flow. Okay, sorry, you might take an ABC forcing, which is the flow is unstable once Reynolds number is greater than about 12 or something. So you get a chaotic flow, okay, and a chaotic field, all right? So that's your basic state. Then you come along and you put in a mean field, and you try and calculate the EMF. And what happens is that it grows exponentially. So that is no use to mankind, okay? So what's the answer? Do you give up? That's one possibility. Or, here's another possibility. You say, this is a kinematic theory. I put in a kinematic field, it's growing exponentially. But you can imagine if you really did this in an experiment, and you came along and put in a dynamical field, of course it won't grow exponentially. And then you say, well, I'll make that dynamical field weaker and weaker and weaker. Do I pick up a linear response? And if I do pick up a linear response, is it the linear response I get from my linear theory? Okay, so then you're into the business of linear response. So that's quite an interesting question anyway. So for MHD turbulence is quite complicated. You might ask that question in a much simpler setting. So what we did at first, you might say, let's take some equations like the Lorentz system, 3 ODEs, which, you know, when you think of that butterfly attractor, it's sort of symmetric. Then you say, suppose I were to perturb the Lorentz equations slightly, and then it'll still be a chaotic mess. Could I pick up that dependence? Would I be able, in the output, to detect, would it be linear? Would it be linear in the perturbation? It's a nonlinear system, but we have a, you know, small perturbation. Surely there should be a linear response. Well, so we looked at this in terms of some maps. I'm not going to have time to do this. So the tent map, you can actually do the theory. But here's a question you might ask. Suppose you take a logistic map, okay? Symmetric cubic logistic map. So the mean over all these trajectories has to be 0 if it's really symmetric. Then you perturb it slightly. So you might push it up or something. Is the response linear in the perturbation? So you work out the, this actually turns out to be, even though it's just a logistic map, turns out to be a horrible problem in a way, numerically, because you need amazing precision to get this right. So that's like normal double precision. You get something weird, so you have to have kind of way beyond double precision, even to get the mean, to calculate the mean. Then you can say, is it linear? So this is our perturbation, our small perturbation of the cubic logistic map, and this is the response, this is the mean. Well, that's not really very linear, right? And so that is a problem. What about in MHD? Does that work? Again, yes and no, okay? For certain cases, yes. We can find turbulent cases where if we put in a field, a dynamical field, so it doesn't blow up, and then we let the strength of the field go down, we pick up a linear response, okay, which is kind of what you want. But even then, you know, even then you can get to more complicated cases where you're struggling to say that these are the Reynolds stresses, is linear in this, okay. And you have to integrate these things forever to get this response, which is not totally satisfactory. So the conclusions, as I said, there's good and bad. So the good is that the theory, I think, is nice. The theory, I think it makes it clear where these two issues in alpha come from, that, you know, people are often arguing about the kinetic and the magnetic alpha. But it also makes clear that alpha is not the be-all and end-all, okay? There are other things, there are other tensors that are just as important as the alpha tensor. We're prejudiced to the alpha tensor because in kinematic theory, that's all you've got, okay? But once you look at an MHD theory, that's not all you've got. And indeed, you can get growth even without any alpha effect, okay? So at that level, it's great. And then the problems arise, okay? And the problems, there's two problems. One is signal-to-noise ratio of calculating averages, and one is that the averages might just diverge exponentially. If they diverge exponentially, can you recover them from the linear response of a dynamical theory? That's not, and I would say that's not entirely clear. So on that slightly gloomy note, I'll stop.
Okay, thank you, David. Questions? Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, David. Very, very interesting topic. Then we also consider this type of effect in fully nonlinear stage. Okay. Then in our formulation, in addition to u dot j you mentioned, we have, for example, omega dot a. Omega dot b showed up. Okay, I don't know why such term did not show up in your formulation. Then my comment is that we need some conditions such effect showed up, as you mentioned, the possible situation. In our formulation, we need some asymmetry of time scales, which coupled with u dot b and b dot omega. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's one condition. Another possibility is that even if such time scale has no asymmetry, in such a case, we need some difference between u dot j and omega dot b. Mm-hmm. So that comes from divergence of u cross b. So in this sense, if we, even if no asymmetry of time scale of this quantity, if we have inhomogeneity, we will get some situation.
Okay.
So that's one comment. And the second comment is that, sorry for a little bit specific topic. We should have talked to this point rather than football itself, okay? But also another interesting point might be that u dot j can be, reformulated with cross helicity coupled with b dot j.
Yeah, I mean,
so u dot b cross b dot j, and also b dot omega can be decomposed with as cross helicity coupled with kinetic helicity. So in this sense, coexistence of cross helicity and this current helicity and kinetic helicity might be very important. That's my point.
I agree that u dot j, just through the divergence theorem and rewriting it, you can throw the curl onto the other one. So u dot j and omega dot b, I can averaged, will be subject to a surface term, will be. Yeah.
So I see the possible situation, this type of work, a kind of hidden dynamo effect showed up. So then you are showing several possible cases. Mm-hmm. Very nice. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, are there more questions? Oh, there's one right in the back. And you can go and set up if you want.
So if I understand correctly, it's difficult to calculate the average on long time scales, but the expression of the tensor, you can still compute them, maybe average on.
Sorry, Nathaniel, I can't hear you very well, sorry.
You can't hear me? No?
I can now, yeah.
Yes. So if I understand correctly, you cannot compute the averages on long time scale easily. But if you try to compute them on shorter time scale, would you get meaningful or result or insightful result? What can they teach us something on short time scales?
Well, that's an interesting point. You can calculate things on a shorter time scale, and you get a better average. But whether it's a meaningful average, that is a different question.
That was my question.
Yeah. Okay. My feeling is no. My feeling is that yes, you can do it, and you get a decent alpha, but that is not what you need.
Okay, let's thank David again.
Can you do it?
And we come to the last talk of the morning session, given by Andy Biggin. He will talk about long-term behavior of the geodynamics.